This is my true story. I worked my whole life to give my son everything: a house, an education, and a future better than mine. I thought when I grew old, he would stand by me the same way I once stood by him. But one morning, I overheard something that changed everything I believed about family. It wasn't anger that broke me. It was laughter. I realized the person I trusted most had already started counting down my final days. That day, I made a decision he never saw coming. Before I tell you what I did, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now, and please subscribe so my story can reach more people. The morning started quiet, like every other day. The air in the house was still, and the smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen. I had woken up earlier than usual because my back hurt from the cold. I sat on the edge of my bed for a while, trying to stretch my legs before reaching for my cane. The house wasn't big, so every sound carried: footsteps, drawers opening, dishes clinking. That's when I heard his voice. My son was in the kitchen with his wife, talking low at first, then laughing. I wasn't trying to listen, but the words came through the thin walls clear as daylight. He said something I can't forget. He laughed and said, "The old man won't last a year. Then everything's ours." The sound of his laugh hit harder than any pain I've ever felt. It wasn't the kind of laugh you hear in a joke. It was mean, sharp, full of certainty. He didn't sound like my son. He sounded like a stranger who had been waiting for me to disappear. I stayed still, frozen behind the door, listening as the plates clattered, and they kept talking like I didn't exist. Every word felt heavier than the one before it. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there, my hand gripping the edge of the bed, my breath shallow. I tried to tell myself maybe I misunderstood. Maybe he didn't mean it that way. But deep down, I knew exactly what I had heard. You can tell when a person stops caring about you. It's in their tone, their rhythm, their ease with cruelty. My son had stopped seeing me as his father. To him, I had become a problem to wait out. When I finally stood up, my knees trembled. The room spun for a moment, and I had to lean against the wall to steady myself. My cane slipped a little on the hardwood floor, but I caught it before it fell. The sound was enough to make him pause in the kitchen. For a moment, there was silence. Then his voice changed. Soft, polite, like nothing happened. "Dad, you're up early?" he said from the other side of the door. I didn't answer. I didn't trust my voice not to shake. I sat back on the bed, staring at the framed photo of him as a child on my nightstand. In that picture, he was 6 years old, missing a front tooth, holding a baseball glove too big for his hand. I remembered the day it was taken. I'd worked an overnight shift at the factory, came home tired, but still took him to the park because he wanted to play catch. Back then, he looked at me like I could fix anything. That memory used to make me proud. Now it made me sick. The noise from the kitchen faded. I heard the front door open, then shut. Their car started, tires crunching on the gravel driveway, then silence again. I sat there for nearly an hour, trying to process what I had just heard. My heart didn't race. It just sank. It was like watching the last light go out in a room you built with your own hands. Eventually, I stood up and walked slowly to the kitchen. The table was still set with 2 half-empty mugs. The coffee was cold. I stared at the chair he always sat in, the one across from me, and I felt something harden inside. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was resolve. I knew then that I wasn't going to wait around to see if his prediction came true. I wasn't going to spend my last years sitting in a house filled with people waiting for me to die. That moment changed me. I didn't cry, didn't curse, didn't shout. I just looked out the window at the yard I'd worked for 30 years to pay off. It was mine. Every brick, every blade of grass. And I finally realized something simple. I didn't owe anyone the rest of my life, especially not the people planning it without me. The truth didn't hit all at once. It came in waves, steady and sharp. At first, I just sat there, staring at the cold coffee mugs left on the kitchen table, trying to make sense of it. My hands were still shaking, but not from age, from realization. Everything I had believed about loyalty, family, and gratitude suddenly felt like a bad story I had told myself for too long. I looked around that kitchen, the same one I'd remodeled with my own hands years ago. Every corner had a memory. The marks on the wall where I measured his height, the dent in the counter from when he spilled paint as a teenager, the window his mother used to clean every Sunday morning. Now, all of it looked empty. I sat in silence for a long time, listening to the clock tick on the wall. Each second reminded me that I had wasted too many years trying to make everyone else comfortable while I disappeared. The boy I once raised wasn't gone. He had just grown into someone who saw me as a number, not a person. I had paid his college bills, helped him buy his first house, even added his name to my account because I thought it was smart to keep it in the family. I thought I was teaching him responsibility. What I actually did was hand him control. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. My wife used to tell me, "You can't teach people how to love you. They already know, or they don't." I never really understood it until that morning. My son knew what love looked like. He just didn't value it. Somewhere between my sacrifices and his comfort, he learned how to take without giving back. That realization hit harder than anything else. The house suddenly felt smaller, tighter, like it was closing in around me. The walls that once made me proud now felt like reminders of everything I'd given up. I had built a home that others lived in, but no longer respected. The sound of his voice from that morning kept echoing in my head. "The old man won't last a year." Those words played over and over until they stopped sounding like an insult and started sounding like an idea. Maybe he was right. Maybe I wouldn't last another year if I stayed in that kind of house, surrounded by quiet greed and forced kindness. I pushed myself up from the chair and walked down the hall. My legs ached, but I didn't stop. I passed the photo frames on the wall. Birthdays, graduations, family dinners, all frozen moments that no longer meant anything. I reached my room, opened the closet, and looked at my old suitcase. It had dust on the handle, untouched since my wife passed away. I brushed it off, opened it, and left it sitting on the bed. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew I wasn't staying. I didn't care where I went. Anywhere would be better than living under the same roof with someone waiting for me to die. The thought of leaving didn't scare me. What scared me was realizing I should have done it sooner. I spent the rest of the day quiet, going through drawers, organizing papers, checking documents. The more I looked, the clearer it became. Everything that was ours was still legally mine. The house, the cars, the savings. All under my name. He didn't expect me to do anything because he assumed I couldn't. That assumption was going to be his biggest mistake. By evening, the sun came through the kitchen window, turning everything gold for a few minutes. I stood there watching the light move across the table, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I felt awake. I finally understood that the moment you stop begging for respect, you start earning back your peace. That night, I slept better than I had in months. No anger, no fear, no second thoughts. Just quiet. I knew exactly what I had to do next. When I woke up the next morning, the house was quiet again, but it felt different this time. The heaviness from the day before was gone. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room. The walls were lined with pictures from every stage of my life. My wedding day, my first construction job, my son as a toddler holding his mother's hand. Each photo told a story I had tried to preserve. I thought of how hard I'd worked to build something that would outlast me. Every nail in this house, every dollar in that account came from decades of sweat, missed meals, and long hours under the sun. But none of it meant anything if the person I built it for had already forgotten the meaning behind it. I remembered when he was 5, small enough to fit in the crook of my arm. I used to wake up early, get him ready for school, and walk him down the street no matter the weather. There were mornings when I went without breakfast, just to make sure he had his lunch packed. I never once thought of it as sacrifice. It was love, simple, quiet, and constant. He used to wave at me from the school gate, yelling that he'd make me proud one day. I used to believe him. Then came the teenage years. The arguments, the distance, the new tone in his voice that sounded more like defiance than independence. I worked double shifts at the factory just to keep up with bills and his school costs. There were months when I slept in the truck between night shifts because the overtime pay was the only way to afford his tuition. I didn't complain. I just told myself it was worth it because he was going to have the kind of life I never did. When he graduated, I remember sitting in the back of the hall, clapping until my hands hurt. He didn't even look back to find me in the crowd. I told myself it didn't matter. Parents don't raise children for gratitude. They do it out of hope. After his mother passed away, things changed between us. I thought her death would bring us closer. Instead, it made the distance permanent. He started treating the house like a hotel, showing up when he needed something and disappearing when he didn't. I covered for him when he fell behind on payments, helped him with his first down payment, even let him move back in when he said he was starting over. I thought maybe this was my chance to rebuild our bond. I didn't realize I was just giving him more access to what was mine. The older I got, the more I saw how entitlement replaces appreciation. I used to think I was teaching him generosity. In reality, I was teaching him that I'd never say no. That was my mistake. The man I saw now wasn't a stranger. He was the product of my own blind love. I had turned every no into a yes until he stopped seeing me as a person with limits. I wasn't a father to him anymore. I was an open door that never closed. Sitting in that quiet kitchen, I replayed every moment when I should have set a boundary and didn't. Every time I gave instead of teaching. Every time I stayed silent instead of standing firm. But regret doesn't fix anything. It just reminds you how much time you've lost. That morning, I made myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window. The yard outside was wet from the rain. The swing I built for him when he was little still hung from the oak tree. It creaked softly in the wind, untouched for years. I realized the house had been ready to let go long before I was. I had been holding on to memories that no longer belonged here. I finished my coffee, set the mug down, and looked around one last time. The photos, the walls, the swing, they were all pieces of a life that had already ended. What came next wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about closing a chapter. It was about walking away before the bitterness swallowed what little was left of me. That morning, I decided not to confront him. There was no point arguing with someone who had already shown what was in his heart. I didn't want another conversation that would end with excuses or fake smiles. I wanted action. Quiet, simple, final action. After I finished my coffee, I went to my room, opened the small drawer in my desk, and pulled out the folder where I kept all the financial papers, account statements, property deeds, old contracts. I flipped through the pages slowly. His name was there beside mine on one thing only, the joint bank account. The same account where my pension, savings, and years of careful planning sat untouched. I stared at it for a while. Then I took a pen and circled my name. He had assumed that account tied us together, but what it really did was give me control. As long as my name came first, I could move every dollar out of it whenever I wanted. He probably didn't even know that. He'd gotten too comfortable thinking I was too old or too tired to handle my own money. That arrogance would cost him. I put the folder in my bag, changed into a clean shirt, and called for a cab. When the driver arrived, I told him to take me to the nearest branch of the bank downtown. It was a small place, quiet, no lines, the kind of bank where the tellers still knew your name. When I stepped inside, the woman at the counter smiled politely and asked how she could help. I told her I wanted to close my account. She pulled it up on her screen, looked at me twice, then asked if I was sure. I nodded once, no hesitation. While she processed the request, I stood there looking out the glass window at the street. People were walking by, young couples, delivery drivers, office workers rushing to lunch. Nobody knew what I was doing or why, and that made it better. For once in my life, a decision that was only mine. When she handed me the cashier's check, I looked down at the amount. Decades of labor, years of saving, everything I had ever worked for sitting on one piece of paper. I folded it carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. I walked out of that bank lighter than I had felt in years. There was no guilt, no doubt. I didn't take anything that wasn't mine. I just reclaimed what I had earned. The air outside felt crisp, and the noise of traffic sounded different, less like chaos, more like freedom. I stopped at a small diner nearby, ordered lunch, and ate in silence. It was the first meal in a long time that didn't taste like worry. After lunch, I went to the post office and picked up a passport renewal form I had been ignoring for months. My wife used to talk about traveling, seeing the world, living simply in a place where nobody knew our name. I had always said someday. I realized that day that someday was now. I filled out the form, mailed it in, and went home with a calm I couldn't explain. When I got back, the house was empty. My son and his wife were still out. I sat in the living room and looked around one last time. The furniture, the walls, the photos, they all looked like pieces of a life I didn't need anymore. I wasn't angry at him anymore. I was done expecting him to be someone he wasn't. The next step was simple. Quietly leave, without warning, without noise, without guilt. That night, I opened my laptop, typed in "flights to Italy," and stared at the screen. The prices didn't matter. The destination didn't matter. What mattered was that I was finally making a choice for myself. The house was quiet, the lights dim, and for the first time in years, I felt in control again. The plan was simple. Disappear without explanation and start over somewhere no one knew my story. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The house was still dark, and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. I sat on the edge of my bed, the cashier's check still folded in my pocket. I could feel it every time I breathed, a reminder that I was finally free to make my own choices again. I didn't rush. I made coffee, ate a slice of bread, and took a slow look around the house one more time. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a museum of things that no longer mattered. Every picture frame, every piece of furniture, every item had a story, but all those stories belonged to the past. When the sun started rising, I got dressed and called the same cab driver from the day before. He didn't ask questions, he just nodded and helped me into the car. We drove back to the bank, the same branch, the same quiet parking lot. This time, I wasn't there to close an account. I was there to move forward. Inside, the same teller recognized me. She gave a small, polite smile, maybe wondering what an old man like me was doing back again so soon. I told her I needed to cash the check and transfer a part of it into a travel account. She typed for a while, printed papers, and asked me to sign. My hand didn't shake, not even once. When she handed me the envelope with the money, I held it tightly, but not with greed, with relief. That money wasn't just currency. It was proof that I still had control over my life. Proof that I could still make decisions without anyone's permission. I asked for part of it in cash, and part wired to an international bank. She asked if I was traveling soon. I said, yes. Very soon, that was all. Outside, the sky was clear. I walked slowly down the street with the envelope in my jacket, each step lighter than the last. I stopped at a small cafe and ordered breakfast. The waitress brought me eggs and toast, and for once, I didn't think about saving or sharing. I ate slowly, enjoying every bite. I thought about how much of my life had gone into saving for everyone else. Retirement, college funds, home repairs, emergencies that were never mine. Now, it was time to spend what was left on peace. After breakfast, I stopped by a travel agency a few blocks away. It was a small office with posters of beaches and cities in the window. I walked in and asked for information about long-term stays in Italy. The woman at the desk looked surprised, but smiled kindly. She printed out options: Rome, Florence, Naples, and a coastal town I had never heard of called Sorrento. I didn't even think twice. I pointed to it. She said it was quiet, warm, and beautiful. That was all I needed to hear. I booked a one-way ticket for the following week. When I left the agency, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Calm independence. Not anger, not sadness, not guilt. Just calm. I had spent most of my life carrying everyone else's needs. That morning, I finally put them down. Back home, I didn't touch anything except my suitcase. I packed light, a few shirts, pants, some photos of my late wife, and my passport. I left everything else behind: the furniture, the car, the house. None of it mattered anymore. The house would be his problem now. Let him pay the bills, handle the taxes, deal with what he thought was waiting for him. He had already counted the years until I'd be gone. I was just speeding up the clock. As I zipped up the suitcase, I looked around one last time. The house was silent, the same silence I used to hate. But now, it sounded like freedom. I took a deep breath and sat for a moment. I realized betrayal doesn't end with shouting or punishment. It ends when you stop caring about being understood. That afternoon, I went back to the bank one last time and withdrew a small sum of cash for travel expenses. The teller asked if I'd like help carrying it, and I told her no. I could manage just fine. Walking out of that bank for the final time, I felt weightless. For years, that account tied me to people who didn't value me. Now, I had cut the rope. The money wasn't revenge. It was release. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the ticket printed out in front of me. Rome. One way. The flight left in 2 days. I kept looking at it, trying to believe it was real. My passport sat beside it, freshly renewed, still smelling like new paper and ink. The suitcase was packed and zipped. I didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to explain. They had made their plans without me, and now I was making mine without them. I spent the evening cleaning the kitchen one last time, wiping the counters, emptying the trash, and turning off the lights. Not because I owed the house respect, but because I wanted to leave it exactly how I wanted to remember it: quiet, clean, and closed. I didn't bother checking my phone. I had already deleted every number I didn't want to see again. The next morning, I woke before the alarm. The air was cool, and the house was still dark. I boiled water for coffee and sat by the window, watching the first light come up over the yard. The oak tree outside swayed gently. It was the same tree where I had built him a swing when he was little, the same swing that now hung still and dusty. I didn't look at it long. Some memories aren't worth revisiting. The cab arrived right on time. The driver, the same man who had taken me to the bank, helped me load my bag into the trunk. We drove in silence. The closer we got to the airport, the lighter I felt. For the first time in decades, I wasn't thinking about bills, schedules, or who needed what from me. My entire life fit into a single suitcase, and that felt perfect. At the airport, the line moved slowly, but I didn't mind. When the airline clerk asked where I was going, I said Italy with a small nod. She smiled and handed me my boarding pass. I found a seat near the window, watching planes take off into the clouds. The noise of the engines wasn't chaos. It was peace in motion. Every sound reminded me I was finally moving, finally living for myself. When my flight was called, I stood up slowly, handed over my ticket, and walked down the narrow tunnel that led to the plane. I didn't look back. There was nothing behind me worth seeing. Once I sat down, I placed my bag under the seat, buckled the belt, and looked out the window. The plane started rolling, and I felt the vibration beneath my feet. The engines roared, and for a moment, I thought about all the things that had kept me grounded for too long: fear, guilt, obligation. And then, just like that, the ground disappeared. As the plane lifted off, the city below grew smaller, the houses shrinking into dots, the streets blending into lines. Somewhere down there, my son was probably waking up, checking his bank app, realizing the balance was gone. Maybe he'd call, maybe he'd shout, maybe he'd finally understand that the man he thought was weak was already gone. Not dead, just free. The flight took hours, but I barely noticed. I stared out the window most of the way, watching the clouds stretch across the sky like calm waves. The stewardess offered me food and water. I took both and thanked her. When the lights dimmed, I closed my eyes and thought about my wife. She had always wanted to visit Italy. I imagined her sitting beside me, smiling at the thought that I was finally doing it. When we landed, the pilot's voice came over the speakers, calm and steady. "Welcome to Rome." I looked out the window at the sunlight hitting the runway. It looked different here, softer, warmer. I took a slow breath and smiled. I didn't feel old anymore. I felt alive. Inside the terminal, the smell of espresso filled the air. I exchanged some cash for euros and walked out into the open world. The sky was bright, the air smelled like coffee and sea salt, and no one here knew my name. That was exactly how I wanted it. The next morning, my phone started buzzing before I even unpacked my suitcase. I was sitting on a bench outside the airport in Rome, watching the sun rise over the city, when I saw his name flash on the screen. I let it ring. It rang again and again. Finally, I answered. His voice came through fast, angry, confused. He kept asking the same question over and over: where the money went, what I was thinking, how I could do this to him. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about what he'd lost. I didn't argue. I just listened. Then, when he paused for breath, I said one thing. I just moved up your timeline. Before he could respond, I hung up. The silence after that call felt perfect. For years, every conversation between us ended with tension, guilt, or disappointment. This one ended with peace. I turned off the phone completely, slipped it into my pocket, and walked out into the morning air. Rome was alive. Scooters on the streets, people talking loudly, cafes already opening their doors. Nobody there knew me as old man or dad. I was just another face, another traveler. The freedom in that anonymity was better than anything money could buy. As I walked through the streets, I thought about what he was doing back home. I imagined him pacing around the house, checking the bank, calling the branch, realizing I had already closed everything properly and legally. Every dollar in that account had my name on it. Nothing he could say or do would change that. He had been waiting for me to die to collect. Instead, I had simply taken my life back while I was still alive. By the time I reached my small hotel near the center of the city, I had stopped thinking about him. The world outside was too big to waste on people who made me feel small. The front desk clerk greeted me with a smile and handed me the keys. My room was small but bright, with a window that opened to a narrow street filled with the smell of espresso and baked bread. I set down my suitcase and sat by the window, listening to the noise of life happening. Laughter, footsteps, distant horns. It was the opposite of the silence that had filled my house for years. Later that day, I bought a cheap Italian phone and gave the number to no one. I didn't want updates. I didn't want guilt trips or fake concern. I wanted distance. I wanted to breathe without someone nearby waiting for the next withdrawal. Freedom doesn't come from wealth. It comes from not having to explain yourself to anyone. That evening, I walked along the streets of Rome, the sky turning gold as the sun set over the buildings. I found a small cafe and ordered pasta and wine. The waiter didn't ask about my past or my family. He just smiled and brought the food. I ate slowly, watching people talk and laugh around me. Nobody was pretending. Nobody wanted anything. They were just living. When I got back to my hotel, I turned my phone on one last time. There were dozens of missed calls and messages, all from him. The last one said, "I hope you're proud of yourself." I deleted it without reading the rest. Pride wasn't what I felt. It was relief. He had taken enough of my time. I wasn't going to give him another second. Before bed, I stepped out onto the small balcony and looked out at the street below. The air was cool, the sky full of faint stars, and the sound of church bells echoed in the distance. I leaned on the railing and took a deep breath. Back home, he was probably angry, pacing, cursing my name. Here, I was calm. That night, I slept with the window open, the sound of Italy outside, laughter, music, cars, filling the room. I didn't dream about revenge or regret. I dreamed about nothing at all. Just peace. Weeks passed before I even looked at a calendar. Life in Italy had its own rhythm. No rush, no noise, no one asking for anything. I rented a small apartment near the sea in Naples. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean, quiet, and bright. Every morning, I woke to the sound of waves and church bells, not phone alerts or shouting. The air smelled like salt and espresso. I made a habit of walking to a cafe near the pier, ordering one small coffee and a pastry, sitting by the window and just watching people. Nobody knew me. Nobody cared who I used to be. That anonymity felt better than wealth. The first few days felt strange. For the first time in years, I didn't have a list of things to fix, bills to check, or people to please. I had time. Real, empty time that belonged only to me. I filled it with small things: morning walks, reading old books, writing notes in a journal I'd bought from a street vendor. I even started cooking again. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. A bowl of pasta, some bread, a glass of wine. Simple things that tasted like peace. Sometimes I sat by the shore, watching fishermen pull in their nets at dawn. The sky turned from black to orange, and the sea reflected every color. I realized how small the world feels when you stop chasing approval. Back home, every day had been about someone else's comfort. Here, I was learning to exist without being useful to anyone. It felt like breathing after years underwater. I met a few neighbors, an old man who owned a bakery downstairs, a woman who sold flowers on the corner, a retired teacher who fed stray cats by the pier. They didn't ask questions. They just smiled, waved, and shared food. There was no curiosity about who I was or what I left behind. People here seem to understand that peace doesn't need backstory. One afternoon, I walked through a market filled with noise and life. Vendors shouting prices, the smell of fruit and cheese mixing in the warm air. I bought fresh tomatoes and bread, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't think about saving receipts or tracking expenses. Money didn't matter the way it used to. I wasn't trying to build a future anymore. I was living one. Nights were my favorite. I'd sit on the small balcony, a plate of food beside me, watching the street below. The sound of laughter carried through the air, mixed with distant music from a radio somewhere. I thought about the difference between noise and life. Back home, the noise came from stress, arguments, responsibility. Here, it came from joy. That's what peace sounds like. People living without cruelty. I never checked my old phone again. Whatever was happening back in North Carolina wasn't my concern. The world I left behind had taken enough from me already. Every now and then, I'd think about my son. Not with anger, but with distance. I wondered if he had finally understood what it felt like to lose something that can't be replaced. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. Either way, it didn't change anything for me. One evening, I took a walk along the shoreline. The sun was setting, and the air felt heavy with warmth. A small boy ran past me, laughing, chasing a red ball. His mother called after him, smiling. I stopped and watched for a moment. The sound of his laughter reminded me of when my son was that age, back when love still meant something. Then I turned away and kept walking. Some memories are meant to stay behind you. My life had finally become quiet, not because I had no one left, but because I had chosen peace over pain. The sea, the food, the faces around me, they were enough. I didn't need forgiveness. I didn't need closure. I had something better: freedom. Months passed, and Italy began to feel less like an escape and more like home. I didn't count the days anymore. Time moved slower here, and I liked it that way. Every morning, I opened the window and let the sea breeze fill the room. I made coffee on the small stove, sat by the balcony, and watched the sunlight hit the rooftops. The noise of scooters, church bells, and voices in the street became my new rhythm. Life had finally stopped feeling like something I needed to survive. It started to feel like something I could enjoy. Sometimes, while walking through the narrow streets, I thought about everything I had left behind. The house, the furniture, the photographs, the years I spent holding on to people who didn't hold on to me. I used to think those things defined me: father, provider, fixer. But they didn't. They were just roles I played until I forgot who I was underneath them. Here, I was nobody special, and that was the best thing about it. Nobody expected anything. Nobody called me for favors. Nobody lied to my face while waiting for my signature on a check. I didn't think much about my son, but every now and then, he crossed my mind. I wondered if he ever sat at that same kitchen table, staring at the empty chair where I used to sit. Maybe he realized the silence I left behind wasn't punishment. It was a lesson. You can't laugh about someone's end and expect to stay comfortable when they choose their beginning. Maybe he checked the mailbox expecting a letter, Or maybe he pretended I never existed. Either way, the result was the same. I was gone. And for once, he couldn't control it. There were moments when guilt tried to creep in, but it never stayed long. I had spent my entire life carrying guilt that didn't belong to me. Guilt for not being rich enough, young enough, patient enough. Guilt for saying yes too often and no too late. I was done with that. I didn't owe anyone an explanation for choosing peace over family that had turned into strangers. Some people call it selfish. I call it survival. In the evenings, I'd walk to the beach and sit on a stone bench overlooking the water. The waves rolled in steady, and the sunset painted the sky in colors that didn't exist back home. I thought about how strange it was that it took me 70 years to finally learn how to rest. Real rest. Not sleep between shifts, not sitting in front of a TV pretending to relax. Just breathing, watching, being. One day, an old woman who sold postcards at the pier asked me where I was from. I told her, "America." She laughed softly and said, "Then why do you look so peaceful?" I didn't know how to answer that, so I just smiled. Maybe because, for the first time, I had nothing left to lose. My wife used to tell me that peace doesn't come from having everything. It comes from walking away from what breaks you. I used to nod when she said it, but I never really understood until now. Standing there in a foreign country, surrounded by strangers, I felt closer to her memory than I had in years. I could almost hear her voice telling me I'd finally done the right thing. I stopped keeping track of money, of years, of what day it was. None of that mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was the quiet satisfaction of knowing I hadn't died waiting for respect that was never coming. I didn't need anyone to visit my grave someday and pretend to care. I wanted to live until my last breath, not fade slowly under someone else's roof. Sometimes I think about the look on my son's face when he realized the money was gone. Maybe that was the first real lesson he ever learned from me. That nothing in this world is permanent. Not comfort, not inheritance, not people. Maybe, in some strange way, I finally taught him something worth remembering. I heard my own son laugh and say, "The old man won't last a year." Those words used to echo in my head like a curse. Now they sound like the start of freedom. He was right about one thing. I didn't last a year. Not in that house, not in that life. I left before it buried me. I took what was mine, turned it into a new beginning, and walked away without saying goodbye. People think revenge is loud, messy, and dramatic. It isn't. Sometimes it's quiet. It's packing a bag, booking a ticket, and letting them wake up one day to realize you're gone and never coming back. Now, I wake up to the sound of waves instead of walls creaking. My days start with fresh air, not tension. I drink my coffee on a balcony overlooking the sea, and I think about how small the world feels when you stop needing permission to live in it. Nobody here calls me old man. Nobody here looks at me waiting for me to fail. I'm just another person who's still breathing, still walking, still choosing. Every step I take on these cobblestone streets is a reminder that I took control back quietly and completely. Sometimes I see families in the square, fathers and sons, laughing, sharing meals. I don't feel bitterness. I feel understanding. Some people are born to teach you kindness. Others are born to teach you limits. My son taught me both. He showed me how cruel entitlement can sound when it laughs out loud. But he also taught me what peace feels like when you finally stop expecting decency from the wrong people. I haven't called him once, and I don't plan to. There's nothing left to say. He's probably still angry, still confused, still telling himself I betrayed him. Maybe one day he'll understand the truth, that I gave him the life he wanted, a life without me. He thought my death would give him wealth. Instead, my decision gave him silence. I didn't take his inheritance out of spite. I took it because I earned every cent of it, and I refused to let my last act in this world be financing his greed. I walk every day along the waterfront, and I think about how easy it is to lose yourself when you spend your life giving everything away. I wish I had learned sooner that love isn't proven by sacrifice, it's proven by respect. Without that, love turns into control. Control turns into resentment, and resentment turns into that laugh I'll never forget. But I don't carry that sound anymore. It stayed behind in that empty kitchen. The people I meet here don't know my story, and I don't tell it. They just know me as an old man who always pays for his coffee in exact change and tips a little extra. Sometimes they ask where I'm from, and I say, North Carolina. They always smile and say, that's far. I nod and answer, not far enough. Because distance isn't about miles, it's about peace. And mine began the moment I stopped explaining myself to people who saw me as disposable. I don't know how many years I have left, but I'm finally living them. No fear, no waiting, no pretending. I walk slower now, eat better, sleep longer. The air smells like freedom, not obligation. My wife would have loved it here. The food, the warmth, the people who greet strangers like friends. Sometimes when I sit by the sea, I imagine she's beside me, proud that I finally kept a promise to myself. He said the old man wouldn't last a year. He was right. I didn't last in his world. I built a new one instead. He lost an inheritance. I found my life.